seems like the European attitude towards trans ideology seems to be souring, at least in some parts of Europe, and to only a limited extent. And I thought, because there's been lots of talk about this, to kind of inject a little bit of, I suppose, reasoned skepticism is what I'm hoping to achieve out of this, because it's not exactly an outright rejection of it, as I would like to see, but a few small steps in the right direction. And I suppose a victory is a victory nonetheless. So I suppose it's somewhat uplifting, but it's still frustrating that we haven't gone the full distance quite yet. And I also wanted to pay attention as well to how the American media has been reporting on European changes, because there has been a change in tone, actually, and in a quite good direction. So I wanted to focus on an article by Forbes, although there have been others as well. But this is just the most obvious distinction, because, of course, obviously articles are written by individuals, normally contributors, but of course they have an editor that selects what articles are written, which ones they approve, and what tone tenor it takes, as well as, lots of other things. And so they're the ones that are shaping the nature of a media outlet. And if they've changed their editorial choices, then the nature of their entire outlet is going to change. Of course, they might get different contributors or ask contributors to write slightly different things, because, of course, lots of people I've noticed, actually, particularly in the sort of online political commentary sphere, just say, oh, the Guardian said this, or the Telegraph said that, when it's a specific contributor, quite often writing an opinion piece. So sure, they've published it, but it's the individual opinion. But when you're looking at an outlet's publications sort of in sum and the tone, as well as something that's very anathema to a previously established trend, you can start to say something about the outlet itself. So with all of that out of the way, let's have a look at some of the Forbes gender ideology puff pieces they've written. So here's one: how anti-transgender laws will affect how we do business. And they're basically saying that the kind of laws enacted by Ron DeSantis that take a more European approach to the gender stuff, in that it's limited to children, limited as in the access is limited to children, not we've limited it to children. And yeah, they're trying to make out that somehow this is going to be some sort of massive inconvenience to employers, when of course not. It's a very small minority of the population, although it is ever growing, unfortunately. We've got another one here. 6 trans entrepreneurs share how anti-trans legislation affects their lives and livelihoods. They were really going quite strong on this back in March. And then here's another one: transgender gay and the hazy terrain in between. And it's also worth mentioning,
I'm pretty sure there's a lot of medical intervention between those two states of existence.
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's even fair to lump them together, being a gay person and transgender completely miles apart. I mean, a gay man may identify as a man, act like a man, and for all intents and purposes be a man, whereas the transgender thing, there's a lot more going on there. But yes, the final thing I wanted to point out about Forbes is they have an entire diversity, equity, and inclusion section on their website. So I think it's safe to say they're at least superficially on board with progressivism, right? Sorry.
Once somebody described Forbes as a right-wing publication to me, all because it's business-focused.
Mm-hmm. So how many times were they hitting their head against a brick wall? How many crayons did they eat? Did they shove pencils up their nose?
I think it was while they were doing all of those things at once they told me that.
Okay, that's quite good multitasking, so they must at least have 1 or 2 brain cells.
Oh, they were in the process of removing them, don't worry.
Understandable. But yes, I'm going to take a quick aside here to mention that I have an episode of Contemplations here about Victorian manners and etiquette, and this is part 2, and I'm also going to be covering, I think it would have released the day before this goes out, because this is pre-recorded, one about Victorian values as well. So I've basically had a Victorian month, unintentionally, where I talk all about all the good things about the Victorian age, and I am very sympathetic to sort of 19th century values, at least cherry-picking the best ones, right? In that there's a lot to be learned in how to treat people politely and well, and how to be a good person from the Victorians that I think we've forgot. And so if you are interested in that, if you're interested in being a better person, make sure to check this out, because I can promise you will be a better person once you've watched it. No money back guarantees, though.
Honestly, Josh has been a lot less insufferable since he started doing all of this.
That is true, unironically. Been focusing more on being good.
Now when I'm around him, I don't have to force the smiles.
You do try and punch me sometimes when we go to boxing, so...
Well,
it's good release, right?
Give and take, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think I did get you in the nose last night.
You did, yeah.
Yes. Finally got him back.
Only slightly. It was okay. But no, we've come a long way. But enough about boxing and back onto what we're actually
like
meant
you're
to be
the
talking.
master or something.
You throw me off. So here we have an article, increasing number of European nations adopt a more cautious approach to gender-affirming care among minors. So I wanted to dissect the tone of this, as well as actually covering the story it's covering itself as well, because this is, of course, talking about Europe and how attitudes are changing in more towards our direction, but not quite. And this is pay special attention to the language that they use. And in particular, the language is in the sort of progressive paradigm. They refer to things as gender-affirming care, but they also quite often use quotation marks rather than just taking it, to borrow an American term, wholesale. And they also present the arguments against this sort of thing quite charitably and reasonably, and they actually kind of admit that maybe there is a point to all of this pushback, which is a long way from a couple of years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, so, somebody was bashing their head against the wall and bashed it enough times to
knock some sense into them.
Pause for a moment and say, hold up, is mutilating children's genitals, is that a good thing?
Yeah, it's bad in all instances, is my opinion, no matter what the reason. So I'm going to read a little bit from this. Increasingly, European nations are adopting a more cautious approach to gender-affirming care among minors. In March of this year, for example, the Norwegian Healthcare Investigation Board announced it would be revising its current clinical recommendations with respect to gender-affirming care, in quotation marks, for minors. The updated guidelines would restrict the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and transition-related surgery to clinical research settings. So it's just purely for experimentation. I mean, I would say that you don't need to experiment with this to know that it's bad. I mean, you don't need to do any research to know that, yes, treating something that is psychological with physical surgery seems to be counterproductive.
I don't want another study to come out the other end of these clinical research settings where annoying leftists on Twitter can point to it and go, well, the study says it's fine, the study said it's okay.
Well, the nature of the research, did a bit of reading to research this segment, although I'm obviously familiar with it to a certain extent, but I kind of looked at the new stuff because, of course, they're publishing new stuff all the time. And the quality of the supposed supporting evidence is appalling. Like, absolutely crayon-eating research methodology, just like, yes. For example, you know, the Dutch study that gets referenced,
I'm very familiar with the Dutch study.
That informs European practices. Did you know that to find out whether people who had undergone transitioning had, resolved their psychological problems, so to speak, in the discomfort, anxiety, depression, this sort of thing, if they were a biological man, they had a biological male one beforehand, right? They had the male questionnaire that was centered around male concerns. And then when they had transitioned, they had a female-centered one. And it would ask some questions like, are your menstruations giving you any discomfort? Well, of course they're not. I mean, if we're evaluating discomfort by those standards, well, they literally can't do that, right? They don't have the biological makeup to have that discomfort.
I think even more fundamentally than that, which is an absolutely ridiculous way of measuring the well-being and the
also
effectiveness.
Self-report. There is such a thing as like a doubling down effect of if someone does something that alters their life forever, the tendency is that they're going to justify it because the notion that they made a mistake and did something wrong would be destructive.
It would be psychologically distressing.
And I feel very sorry for those people, like genuinely. I'm very annoyed at people pushing the ideology on people, but that doesn't mean I don't feel very sorry for the people who go through this and regret it. That must be truly terrible.
Well, I agree with everything that you just said, but once again, obviously those are problems switching the actual forms that they were writing on, they were responding to, and going off purely self-report. I think also the very fact that the only thing that they were really measuring the success rate on was the self-reported psychological effects,
Yes.
whereas they'd had no study into the potential negative physiological effects of taking these hormones, how sustainable it would be. I mean, I didn't click on it yesterday, but there was I follow a Twitter account called Males in Disguise, amusing title.
I wonder what that's about.
Which put up an image yesterday, which thankfully was censored, which said another example of a failed neo-vagina. And I thought, do I want to click on this?
Oh.
No, I don't. But I don't want to imagine what it showed, because I think my imagination is heinous enough. I don't need to confirm it. But
I think every man in the audience just crossed his legs in discomfort.
yeah, just because the self-reported psychological effects are positive does not mean it will not have completely destructive physiological effects that will affect you for the rest of your entire life. I mean, when the Surfs appeared on Timcast recently and they had the big debate, and
It's
the subject,
so frustrating.
the subject of Jazz Jennings came up, and the whole aspect of what he has to do down there to prevent what is literally an open wound from closing in on itself using, I think, a dilator, is revolting and disgusting, and should obviously be taken into account in any studies, but they will purely go off of the psychological self-reported effects of it, where the people go, well, I said I wanted to be a woman, and now I feel like I'm a woman, so therefore I feel much better. Yeah, but you're going to have a lot of other problems.
I'll tell you how I feel sick hearing about it.
It's revolting.
I even know about it.
You chose to do the segment on trans stuff, so
I know.
Sadly this is part and parcel.
I know. This is what I did when I agreed to be a psychologist, I suppose. So it carries on to say the updated guidelines would restrict the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and transition-related surgery to clinical research settings. I think I read that bit. But Norway joins other European nations such as Finland, Sweden, and the UK. Look at that, Sweden. The glorious Islamic Caliphate of Sweden actually doing something good. I suppose it's all the Islam, isn't it? They're not big fans of this.
No.
In introducing limits on provisions of gender-affirming care to minors, in the US, a partisan divide is shaping up between the states that allows for and guarantees access to youth gender-affirming care and the states that ban or severely restrict gender-affirming care for minors. There doesn't appear to be much middle ground. Thus far this year, 12 states have either banned or severely limited gender-affirming care. We're not focusing on the United States, though, but they're basically saying that, yes, it's very polarised. Some states are banning it, some states are enshrining it in law.
Not only enshrining it in law, but I think having it put into law that they're sanctuary states. So
Yes.
children who say, I'm a girl now, and dad goes, no, you're not, you're a boy, put that lipstick away, stop wearing your mother's underwear, that's disgusting. And they go, no, screw you, Dad, I'm going to run away. And they run away, and there are some states, probably Oregon, places with, California, places
Washington,
like Portland,
the
LA,
coasts, basically.
The coasts.
Except the South.
Are saying, that's right, we'll accept you. Well, you can come in, we'll look after you, which is, I mean, I know the OK groomer thing is a meme, and it's not been done to death, and people don't do it as much, but the entire state declaring itself, that's right, we are a groomer state, this is what we support, we will indoctrinate your children and then accept them when they decide to run away, which can only have positive results, I'm sure.
It was literally a policy in the Soviet Union that children like rat out their parents or flee their parents to become children of the Soviets, and that's basically what's going on now.
I think one child was actually considered basically turned into a state hero because he ratted out his parents for anti-Soviet thought crimes.
Pavlik Morozov, yeah.
Oh, you know the name of him as well.
Yeah, I'm a massive Soviet history nerd, yeah.
Oh, that's all right then.
Yeah, I know it all inside out. But yes, it carries on to say the US talk of introducing guardrails is sometimes met with being branded transphobic or a science denier. The irony of that last one as well, because the science is not on your side on this. They
will change the science. These new research clinical settings. That's what I'm annoyed about. The serfs will have more terrible studies to point at uncritically.
Mm-hmm. The annoying thing is most people don't understand how to read research either. It's just like, there's one study that says the thing I agree with. And it's like, yeah, one study
I read the abstract and it said it's on my side, therefore.
But yeah, one study means nothing in you've got to have loads and loads of studies to mitigate the individual research biases that researchers bring to the table.
But then even if you go with a meta-study, a meta-analysis of the
It's
studies,
still
you've got to take into
conducted
account...
by researchers.
You've got to take
isn't it?
into account the bias of the person who conducted the meta-analysis.
But there actually are some really good meta-analyses out there on controversial topics that do a good job of just trying to represent it honestly. So I know people are just like, oh, science is terrible, oh, this and that. But, you know, there is good stuff going on out there.
This is true.
I'm not saying it as some sort of cope or because I am a scientist myself. I'm somewhat of a scientist myself. No, I'm not trying to quote the Green Goblin. But just to say, it's not all bad.
Suspicious green gas every now and again.
Excuse me. But it goes on to say, but caution with respect to gender-affirming care for minors may be warranted, as European experience indicates. This is an American mainstream outlet saying that restricting this care might actually be a good idea. I know, pinch yourself. You're not dreaming. This is actually going on. And it says, a series of European-based systematic reviews of evidence for the benefits and risk of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones have shown a low certainty of benefits, which is a very charitable way of saying, yeah, they're not good. Specifically, longitudinal data collected and analysed by public health authorities in Finland, Sweden, and the Netherlands and England have concluded that the risk-benefit ratio of youth gender transition ranges from unknown to unfavourable. Well, I mean, this is actually put in quite good terms, actually, isn't it? I mean, that is a good representation of the data as I understand it. So it says, as a result, across Europe, there has been a gradual shift from care which prioritises access to pharmaceuticals and surgical interventions to a less medicalised and more conservative, that's conservative with a small c, so cautious, they mean, rather than politically conservative, approach that addresses possible psychiatric comorbidities and explores the developmental etiology of trans identity. Bless you.
I'm so terribly sorry.
It's hot in Britain, which is a rare thing, and Harry's allergic to it.
There's a lot of
pollen.
There's a lot of pollen in the air this morning, and I'm just suffering terribly from it.
Pollen's in the air. Sorry. In turn, this has brought about the imposition of restrictions in Europe on access to hormones. Currently, minors in most European countries, not the most European, can access puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, but only if they meet stringent eligibility conditions. Apparently, I can't read. I'm going to blame the pollen for that. And this is increasingly done in the context of a tightly controlled research setting. So yes, we're a lot stricter than the United States. And I'm going to be talking about this a little bit later, but the gist of it is that the United States, someone comes to a clinic and the clinician is just an enabler, whereas in Europe, we take the view that, you know, the practitioner, the actual so-called expert, takes primacy. They're the one controlling things, and therefore there's a lot more skepticism to the intentions because, of course, you may be held legally liable for it, which does go on if you suggest it. And so it's a risky thing that I think practitioners of medicine over here and psychologists are perhaps more understanding of than in the United States, where it seems like the legislative situation is far kinder to enablers of these things than they are over here.
There is a reason that England is called Turf Island.
There is, yes.
And have you seen recently there was a map that somebody put together where it was the global map, and if you saw a light dot on it, then that was where transphobic tweets or transphobic tags had become popular and shared about by people. And they said, notice how England, how the UK is just a big neon dot. The whole place was lit up in comparison to everybody everywhere else.
England number one. Yes. I actually did a segment called Turf Island number one quite a while ago.
I think I was sitting in on it with you.
You were, yeah. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? So it carries on to say, where were we? Many European countries do not allow the use of cross-sex hormones until the age of 16, and only after completing a number of psychotherapy sessions. In addition, the vast majority of European countries ban surgery until the age of 16, which I think it should be at least higher, if not banned entirely, because I don't think there's any purpose in it. But then also, I think that if adults want to make stupid decisions, they should be allowed to face the consequences of said decision without being stopped. So, there's... yeah.
Sorry, I was looking for the map.
That's all right.
I didn't entirely pay attention.
Hopefully you at home were paying attention to me.
The pollen's gone to my head.
From puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones to surgery, the rules across Europe tend to be either stricter than many jurisdictions in the US or in the process of tightening. For example, Sweden's National Board of Health and Welfare states children should not receive puberty blockers outside of clinical trials and they must be at least 12. That's not exactly particularly conservative with a capital C, is it? 12. I mean, that's still going to have a very destructive effect on their development. I mean, it affects all sorts of things from skeletal structure to
Brain
neurological development. Yes. So it's still not good.
Even just social development, seeing all of the rest of your friends go through puberty while you're stuck not going through puberty if you're on these blockers. That will obviously have a psychological effect.
It's not good, and I don't think they should be used at all, certainly not on children. Well, I suppose it's redundant if you use them on adults as well, so they shouldn't be used at all. In England, among the reasons for shutting down the Tavistock's Gender and Identity Development Service in 2022, physicians reported concerns that some patients were referred to gender transitioning pathways too quickly. Hilary Cass, who led an independent review of gender identity services for children and young people, said that there was insufficient evidence for her to give any firm advice regarding the routine use of puberty blockers. She has told the National Health Service to enrol young people being considered for hormone treatment into formal research protocol. So they're basically trying to say, we need more evidence. I think that if they look at the evidence, they're going to be like, okay, this is horrifying. And I mean, it shouldn't have to come to looking at the evidence at all. I think we have enough to dismiss it.
I found the map and I'm sending it to John. John, I've sent you the map if you want to put that up on screen.
What was this map again?
It was the map of transphobic engagement.
Okay, yes, I'm quite keen to see this.
And of course, transphobic engagement meant hashtags including things like "let women speak" and such.
Oh, look at that glowing beacon of sanity in the world.
My goodness.
What is this? I feel a bit of national pride for once.
Turf Island #1.
Yeah. I mean, the TERFs are still feminists and still my political enemies, but still, it's a small thing. It's a small victory. We've got to take what we can get these days.
It's just quite funny.
It is, yeah. So it carries on. I've only got a little bit left to read, and then we're going to break it down a bit more. In Finland, gender experts have expressed concerns that some patients who've been prescribed drug treatments didn't meet the strict eligibility requirements detailed in the so-called Dutch protocol. In the 1990s, the Dutch gender specialist began laying the foundations for gender-affirming healthcare for minors, described as careful and cautious approach. It was devised by clinicians and documented meticulously from the late 90s through to 2012. Clinicians in other European countries also observed that guidelines were not being strictly followed, effectively allowing for what could be deemed as unauthorized treatment of many more minors, especially girls, than was envisaged by the Dutch experts who devised the original protocol. I think this is something that informed EU law as well. And so there's some sort of legislative enforcement of this sort of Dutch protocol as the bare minimum thing you need to do. You can just ban it outright, and I don't think the EU would necessarily intervene here. I don't think they're as strong gender ideologues as they are strong socialist ideologues, in that that's more what they're pushing for, sort of more traditional Marxism rather than this intersectional, more American university-based form of progressivism, I suppose you could say. Because I'm not going to blame all of America, but certain Democrat cities with universities seem to be the progenitors of this sort of thing. And it says, it ends with, ultimately, this gave rise to health authorities in Finland, Sweden, and the UK conducting systematic reviews of evidence for the benefits and risks of hormonal interventions. Subsequent findings of these reviews suggested that the studies cited in support of hormonal interventions for adolescents are of very low certainty. In turn, this led to placements of severe restrictions on access to hormones. It also advances the notion that such interventions are still in an experimental phase. Well, they're saying that more experimentation is needed, so of course they are. So yes, it seems like Europe is at least starting to push back to some extent, not nearly far enough for my taste, but there also have been other mainstream outlets, particularly some insufferable ones like The Atlantic, which I hate. A teen gender care debate is spreading across Europe where they talk about the same sort of thing and actually present the evidence that we've been talking about for years at this point. And yes, it seems like this is actually bleeding over to America, so it seems like Europe might actually have a positive effect in injecting some sanity into your conversation, so you're welcome, I suppose. There's also here the Washington Examiner, which is not a progressive outlet and publishes some good stuff, also talking about it as well, but it's fair to call them mainstream. But yes, it seems to be that Europe is affecting American discourse rather than it being the other way around for once. And we're actually, seemingly pushing things slightly in the right direction.
I think it could also be put down to the effect of people like Ron DeSantis pushing back against this as well.
Yes.
And a lot of people, I have my disagreements with him, but people like James Lindsay and other people on Twitter going around exposing what's going on. Libs of TikTok especially has been very, very good at pushing back on this and been very good at exposing what's going on behind the ideology to a lot of people, especially with her exposure on shows like Tucker Carlson when he was still on Fox. I think there are a lot of, I don't want to put it all down to Europe the same way that we don't want to blame all of the problems to America.
Of course,
there is a lot of
domestic
pushback that's come from within America as well.
But I think in part DeSantis has modelled his approach to restrictions on the pre-existing ones in Europe, right? And that's good for multiple reasons. One, tried and tested, and obviously we know it's a good thing in and of itself to restrict this and should go further. But also he can say, from a political point of view, well, I'm not literally genociding trans kids, as some trans activists say. They're doing this in Europe. So, what are you on about? No one's saying it there. Even the activists kind of have an understanding of why it's being done. It's not a deliberate sort of attack on your existence. It's that we have concerns about this because it doesn't seem reasonable or safe.
I disagree that the activists have a firm grasp on why it's done. I mean,
not a firm grasp, and not all of them, but some of them. And certainly more so than some of the United States ones, right?
Perhaps.
But
I disagree, to be perfectly honest with that. I think that these activists, if they don't have, if they do have a grasp on it, then they at least have a vested interest in acting as though they don't and saying that no, by denying this, you are committing a form of genocide. But anyway,
I've just seen some trans people saying, "Okay, I kind of get it now." I've seen a sort of increase in that.
Well,
obviously,
I must have missed that.
Yeah, obviously. It's the vocal, annoying ones that are just like, any sort of restriction whatsoever is literally killing me. I hate that. That's annoying.
Also,
and it's also everywhere.
On your point from earlier that the articles themselves are written by individual people and not the outlet themselves, and the outlet just published them, I've just noticed this one's written by Deborah So.
I was going to point that out, actually.
Yes,
but do carry on.
I've got her book, The End of Gender, which I actually need to read. She's a sexologist who's done a lot of research into this and does push back a lot against the trans ideology. Great. So I'm looking forward to getting around to read that eventually.
So the same article here is in the body of text, was published in a different outlet. This next one, this is the same article by Dr. Deborah So. It starts the same way, but I think in sort of editing, the editor chose to change the title to something that is misleading, basically. The previous one was a good representation, that people are pushing back somewhat, but it's got a long way to go. This one says, Norway advises against child sex changes, joins Finland, Sweden and the UK in rejecting gender ideology. And I don't think that that's really what's going on here. I think that the editor here, who may well have changed the title, has misrepresented the situation. It's not been rejected, it's just a softer version of it. If they rejected it, I'd be chuffed, but no, that's not what's going on. And I don't want to give people false hope, but there's some hope here at least. It's not an entirely depressing bit of news for once. So I finally wanted to draw attention to this article here and the great work. I believe this is an academic, Lior Sapir, I think. I don't know how to pronounce their name, but they did a really good job in summarising the general debate as well as pointing to some of the evidence. And I wanted to point out that they're saying he's correcting the notion that trans people in the United States are saying, oh, not a single country in Europe has banned gender-affirming care for trans youth. And in some senses, they are actually right, but it's also far more restricted. And they go through and break down.
He is right that we're not going nearly far enough.
But he goes through and breaks down all of the evidence in a very good way, and because he's an academic, he's got good citations and stuff. So if you want to know the distinction between the Europe and the US and explaining it, this is probably a good thing to check out. We're not in any way affiliated. I just thought he did a good job, and when I see people doing good things, I like to give them the credit they deserve. And yes, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, make sure to check that out. And they also did a good article breaking down the, if you move on to the next one, John, this one here, Reason and Compassion on Gender Medicine. And they're talking about the people testifying in Florida in favor of transitioning, and the actual medical community's reaction to it was very skeptical. And this sort of inside breakdown of both the arguments of the advocates of gender ideology and the actual medical world, and the distinction between the two, is actually very good. And because it's quite insightful and broken down in a way where it's weighing up the evidence and the arguments, is quite impressive, really. And this is from November of 2022. But these are good places to read up on. And I wouldn't have the time to go through them all because, it's already quite long as is. And so I just wanted to draw attention to them because they go into greater detail. But I do actually intend at some point in the future going through the published scientific literature on trans studies and breaking it down, because I actually specialized in research methodology and statistics and things like that. And so that's my bread and butter. And so I think I'd be quite well suited to breaking it down in a way that would make sense, and why these studies are flawed, and why some things can be taken for granted, some things can't, and that sort of thing. But it's going to be a lot of work. So it might not be necessarily soon, but I intend to do so. And I haven't really seen it done to such an extent, like a proper literature review, but in sort of video form. Most academics tend to publish a paper rather than do a video explaining it to normal people that aren't academics. And I think that there's a great benefit in that. So I am going to be doing that at some point, and hopefully you are still around to watch it. But
one to watch out for.
But yes, there is some pushback in Europe to a limited extent. It's not quite far enough, and hopefully it's going to have a positive effect elsewhere as well. And I think it's also worth mentioning as well, a lot of these countries that I mentioned are Western European. I know there was also a mention of France and the Netherlands potentially pushing back as well. And I think these are countries that are more in the sort of American sphere of influence, and therefore it's more pervasive. And obviously, gender ideology not representative of America as a whole. So I'm not, tarring you with that brush. It is un-American in my opinion. But lots of Eastern European countries haven't done these things simply because it's not present. They don't have a reason to do it because it doesn't exist. And so the countries in Europe that are pushing back as well, it's also worth mentioning, are the ones that have had this infiltrate their countries to a certain extent. I mean, you even had Macron saying we need to resist American imperialism in the sense of, we're getting all these silly ideas from progressives in France and it's un-French and we shouldn't have it. And he's seen as a moderate. And obviously, I don't approve of him, but there is lots of pushback against it, which is a promising thing. Hopefully it's a sign of a tide turning, although I wouldn't hold your breath because I'm sure the gender advocates have a few cards up their sleeve to pull yet.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Contemplations series, this episode on Victorian manners and etiquette. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.